I think we'll talk about some of the complexities in this because I'd like to talk about all the factors involved. In your book, it said on average over the last 10 years, 67% of asylum seekers were men. Over 80% were under the age of 35 years. And men immigrants or asylum seekers outnumbered women at a 2.81 to 1 ratio. I know that when this is discussed from a criminological perspective, and this has been discussed in Australia in terms of crime rates amongst certain communities, such as the Sudanese community, what people say is that any migrant community where the sex ratios suddenly become extremely unbalanced, you see this in, I think, China is another example, you have an increase in the number of sexual assaults against women. So that's one factor. The other thing we have to be, I suppose, mindful of is that sexual assault rates, even amongst migrants and Muslim migrants, would be a small percentage of the population. But what people say is the sexual assault rate is much larger, say, in Germany amongst native-born Germans. But actually what we're talking about is standardisation to the population. So, in fact, when you standardise the rates of sexual assault against a migrant population, they may be orders of magnitude larger than the general population. They're the points that I like to get clear. How important is each factor? Because I felt like you were saying, well, there is the cultural factors, whether that be, say, someone coming from Afghanistan with the Pashtun tribal values and, Islamic values, the fact that the ratio is severely skewed, the fact that people are coming from countries that are war-torn like Syria and they're traumatised. How would you weigh all those things up? What would you give more weight to, if you had to do the analysis?
I say that in the book. It is all three factors. The cultural factors that we just talked about now, but yes, also the sex ratios. And here I think a woman called Valerie Hudson has done some very good work on that, where she shows that where these sex ratios are skewed to that extent, you do get spikes in sexual misconduct, but also aggression in general. And so you have a large number, you have a youth bulge, you have a large number of men, and there aren't enough women for these men. So she says that's a very, very important factor. She looked into Sweden and other Scandinavian countries, and she sees that. In fact, when she was doing her research in Sweden, she was condemned for doing it, but she says that they are playing with fire, the Swedish government, by taking an experiment of this kind to the point where their own society now, because of this immigrant men, it is now highly, highly skewed. And she says that a lot of the violence that we've been seeing in Sweden lately, perpetrated by immigrant men, can be explained by this factor. So she does put a lot of emphasis on that demographic sex ratio that's off. And then on the broken societies, when I was a translator-interpreter, I saw this with my own eyes in the Netherlands, that young men who had missed out, their tribal society was broken down. So the tribal code didn't apply to them. The authoritarian government of Mohammed Siad Barre had broken down. And so they weren't even familiar with institutions like the police or the military or any other order-keeping institutions. They were born in perfect anarchy. And they were used to witnessing a lot of violence, and a lot of violence was perpetrated against them. These were young men who were locked up, were beaten. Some of them were forced into doing things they would otherwise not do. And yes, then they are very, very traumatized. And in many ways, I would say also very hardened. And so when you go through some of these court cases and you read through, I thought it was striking that very often when the judge asks or members of the people at the court, do you feel sorry? Do you have any remorse? These men show absolutely no remorse whatsoever and would perpetrate that particular crime again, and felt misunderstood by their own communities, if they had any, and the new ones that they had come into. And so, yes, that is also a very, very important factor. And you have to take all three of these, the religious, cultural variables, the sex ratio, that is the youth bulge of men, and also these men who are coming from war zones and violent societies. There was one Eritrean man, again, I think it was in Scandinavia, in Norway, where he was very open and honest about it. He was asked, would you treat women in your country that way? And he said, yes, we do that all the time. And so I don't think that these young men, if they've ever been interviewed, are actually really dishonest about what their motivations are or why they do it. It's the social workers, the politicians, sometimes members of law enforcement, the media, academia, who are trying to make excuses for them that the young men aren't even using. And so I think the conclusion is it's very, very important to understand all the factors that contribute to this misconduct. But the one conclusion is that we have to start integrating these young men.